Greetings and welcome to another lecture in introductory psychology. This one is on, not surprisingly, parenting styles. Now, researchers have divided up the various ways that we here in the United States, anyway, I can't say that this is necessarily cross-cultural, but how people in the United States parent, and they've managed to come up with a couple of different categories. Now, these may look somewhat familiar. I also want to point out that when I'm talking about how children turn out when raised by these particular styles, that it's not a guarantee that you can have children raised in really poor styles that turn out as well as vice versa. So the first parenting style, and luckily these are also named after exactly what they are, is called authoritarian. Now, someone who's an authoritarian is like a supreme ruler. They are a king or a queen, and oftentimes it has overtone of tyrant to it. Now, authoritarian parents have rules, and these rules are rules. There is no breaking, no bending, no kidding, no nothing, okay? You stick to the rules or else. You don't stick to the rules, the odds are bad things are going to happen to you. Children are not to speak to parents except when told to jump, they may ask how high. I mean, it's like being raised in boot camp, in that there's no questioning, there's no disobeying. If you disobey, you're likely to be punished very swiftly and often very severely. Follow the rules or else, in other words. And the problem with this kind of parenting, if this is the style of parenting that children are exposed to by one or both or all parents, is that the kids don't tend to turn out very well. These children, when they grow up, tend to be very self-absorbed. They tend to be only worried about themselves. They can't necessarily worry about other people. Now, in boot camp, what happens is military recruits are often kind of broken down so that they can be built up as a unit. They're broken down as individuals and built up to think of themselves as part of a unit. You don't get that in authoritarian parenting. You just get people getting broken down. And so they have a tendency to be very worried about themselves and what happens to them, and probably not too much what happens to other people. They also have higher rates of substance abuse, which makes sense when you think about it, because if you're terrified that if you do the slightest thing wrong, that the wrath of God is going to fall upon your head, that could pretty much lead anybody to want to escape for a while. And that's also true of these people. People who grow up with authoritarian are often afraid to do anything. A side effect of punishment is actually learned helplessness, where people become terrified that, or animals become terrified that any movement they make can result in something bad happening because they don't understand what's happening, or they don't know what they're doing wrong, or what. And you can also get that here. Now, the violence often comes from the fact that authoritarian parents tend to use physical punishment, such as spankings, which may escalate to beatings. There's a fine line often between the two. There's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that children who are raised with physical punishment, such as spankings, particularly regular spankings, are more likely themselves to be violent. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. If a child, thinks the child could wind up thinking to him or herself, well, when I don't do what Daddy says or Mommy says, they hit me. So if little Susie doesn't do what I want, I can smack her. And so we do have a tendency to see more violence here. And you got to admit that makes sense, particularly if you're like 8 years old. So yeah, authoritarian parenting alone is really not a very good thing. Now, the opposite, the polar opposite of authoritarian parenting is permissive parenting. And with permissive parenting, it is pretty much the opposite. There are no rules. There are no guidelines. Children can do whatever they want. Children are not punished for what they do wrong. There are no consequences for their behaviors. And they are often, they can do whatever they want. They do something bad, very often the parent will wind up cleaning it up. Unfortunately, we see a lot of this type of parenting these days. There's a pendulum swing, and it goes from the authoritarian my way or the highway, and now it's swung over to the permissive, because a lot of parents don't want to punish their children, don't want to give them rules because it might squelch their growth and their creativity and whatnot. Although I gotta tell you, teachers hate these kids. Hate them. Because the teacher does not like to be the first person to tell this child no, or to tell this child that there are rules that need to be followed. Because I can tell you right now that when that child goes home and talks to the parent is going to come down on both feet on the teacher. How dare you tell my child no? How dare you dare my child to get it? Well, your child is disrupting the class. If you were a better teacher, then they wouldn't be, and so forth. It's not a pleasant thing. There's two ways to be permissive. Neither of them are very good, but one is a little better than the others. Permissive Indulgent. And with Permissive Indulgent, children have no rules, they have no guidelines, but their parents do indeed love them, parent or parents. They know that they are loved by their parent or parents, even though, and they're not given any rules or whatnot. So this one is okay. The kids are still holy terrors when they get to school, but at least the children grow up knowing that, someone loves them. Permissive indifferent parenting, on the other hand, children may have everything that they want or everything they need, but what they don't get is their parents. They don't get attention, they don't get love and affection and communication and such with the parents. And sometimes the parents are literally not around. Now, neither of these tend to turn out well, although permissive indulgent turns out a little bit better than permissive indifferent, because permissive indulgent children at least know that their parents do love them. These children tend to be very dependent because they tend to be given everything that they want. All they have to do is ask for it, or scream for it, or throw a tantrum for it, and they get whatever they want. So they don't learn that in the real world you usually have to work for things that you want. So they're dependent, they're immature, they don't understand the word no, they often don't understand the words not now, you have to wait, they don't want to wait, they've never had to wait, and so they misbehave because they have simply never run into rules and regulations before. And you could still run into adults that behave something like this. Rules are for other people, regulations are not for me, I get whatever I want, sort of thing. Not particularly pleasant. Now, the third parenting style, or the fourth, depending on how you're counting, it's a combination, actually, of those first major two. I call it the traditional parenting style because when you think back of how, at least we think that children are raised in the 50s and 60s and whatnot, in the good old days, as you or your parents may call them, although things were not necessarily that good then either, it's just that we don't remember them. There was still drug use, there was still divorce, there was still adultery, all the things that we're doing now we were doing then. We just simply didn't publicize them nearly as much as we do now. But I digress. So if you go back and you look at TV shows and movies and stuff from that time, generally what you see is that the mother is very nurturing and the father is the disciplinarian. So what we're looking at there is a combination of one authoritarian parent and one permissive indulgent parent. It's the wait till your father gets home, or, when your dad gets home, you're going to be in trouble, or you want to do something, ask mom, she'll give in to anything sort of thing. Now, kids who are raised by this sort of traditional parenting turn out pretty good. Because as it turns out, children, as much as they may protest otherwise, like rules. They like to know what to expect. They like to know what is expected of them. They like to know that when they do this, this is going to happen. Kids actually kind of like that, as do adults. It's kind of weird to be someplace where there are no rules. At first it's fun, but eventually it gets a little weird. These kids turn out pretty well because they are getting guidance, which is good, and they're getting love, which is also good. The first two, you either get guidance or love, and sometimes you don't even get that. Okay, you don't get all of those together at the same time. So these kids turn out pretty good. Because the thing is, though, a lot of times they wind up, for instance, maybe even being afraid of their father, or respecting the father but not loving him because they're afraid of him. And mother often is thought of as being kind of a doormat. So there may not be a whole lot of respect here, but kids turn out pretty good. Now, studies have found that the best style of parenting is also not surprisingly the hardest, at least in part because I suspect an awful lot of us were not raised this way. It's called authoritative, and I apologize for the name that is so close to authoritarian, but I didn't name the darn thing. Authoritative parenting combines both guidance and rules along with love and affection in the same package. There are indeed rules that children are expected to follow. But, for instance, if the child thinks that there is a good reason for something, the child can talk to the parent. Parents listen to children. Parents talk with children, not just to them or at them, like you see with authoritarian or permissive, where the talk basically means nothing. So, if a child can, for instance, explain why it's a good reason that the child should be allowed to stay out an hour or two later one night, for instance, and the reason is a good reason, not something like, well, because everyone else is, then authoritative parents will listen and they may give in. They can bend the rules. They can alter them as the children age. They They're not rigid and inflexible like the authoritarian parent. Now, they do punish. This is not to say that authoritative parents don't punish. They do. It's just that oftentimes they're not perhaps as quick to punish as the authoritarians are. But one thing that the authoritative has that authoritarian doesn't is love and affection. Permissive parents give love and affection, but they don't give the guidance. And children want both. Children understand that they are loved and that they are that they are worthy. And they also gain self-esteem by being able, for instance, to communicate with adults, to talk with them, to plead to their peace, to let them know, well, yes, I believe I should be allowed to do this because, and so forth and so on. Kids get off on that, and it's really good training for them to be able to do that, to be able to plead their own case. Kids raised with authoritative parenting tend to turn out really quite good because they've learned to communicate, they've learned to feel good about themselves, they've learned to not be doormats, they've learned not just to demand but to have reasons, they've learned that they can't always get what they want. Just because a child comes up with what seems like a good argument doesn't mean the parents will automatically give in authoritative. So this is where you tend to get the best outcomes. But this is extremely difficult. And there are times probably that it can't be done. If your child is running out into traffic, your 4-year-old's playing in the street and it's a busy street, you're not necessarily want to go out and try to reason with them. You're going to go out and get them the hell out of the street and then maybe talk to them. So it does have to be geared toward the age of the child. But generally, authoritative parenting has been found in studies to give the best results in terms of well-adjusted kids and well-adjusted adults.